believe we're live. Yes, indeed. Don't remember what resolution it is set at. We'll see if I can keep up with 1080p. All right. Well, let's send out the Twitter notice. Given everything here, let's get my workspace. Okay, so with all that, as some of you know, I like to play with cars and have been playing with ECUs and tuning of a drag race car for a while. And I've been using a spreadsheet that has just kind of gotten out of hand. It's the usual thing. Spreadsheets are fun and easy to start with for here's my rough concept and I can write up some formulas, but it quickly kind of grew out of just, well, here, let me see if I can show you. So I nicknamed the car Cobra Commander, not what not what my co-owner calls it, but there's a lot of things that go into doing fuel tunings and ignition tunings. So at a basic, you need to know some engine parameters about how much air is going to get drawn into the system, and you need to know about your flow rates for your fuel injectors to be able to figure out how much time should you pulse the fuel injector to hit a particular air-fuel ratio, and what air-fuel ratio you're trying to hit. With gasoline, it's 14.7 to 1 air to fuel, but that can be different if you were doing propane or methanol or ethanol. And of course, air temperature and pressure, and so you get into all these things of tables of, this is how much volumetric efficiency do you get at different points in the table, and the formulas that come behind all these things start to get really large, where these are the inputs, but then here's these calculated values that start to come through. Anyway, I just have kind of gotten to the point where looking at a raw table like this is actually really hard to make sense of it. And normally what tuning software, like say Tuner Studio, shows is sort of these maps, like surface maps or surface plots of the overall space. And that helps visualize a bit of where are you dropping off too quickly, or overall behavior. So I've been wanting to build something to do that for a while, and I haven't done front-end design for real since the mid-90s. And I played with a few things, but I poked around, and I stumbled across VueJS recently, and this caught my attention. So don't know how much time I really have tonight. We'll see how far we get, but I'm just going to kind of work through setting up everything from scratch. I know that the Getting Started guide here, I've done a little look through, and they pretty much tell you, if you're doing this new, don't start with the command line tool. Just do some basic, like include scripts and stuff. They are very clearly focused on only, like, they don't want you to get lost in trying to set up all the tooling for NPM and other things. Now, I happen to come with a background of building lots of system software and things, and I'm happy with the command line, and I also get how build tools generally work. So I'm going to go ahead and actually install Vue CLI, and as is most things in the JavaScript world, this is all done with NPM. So if I go ahead and install Vue CLI, and I'm going to install it globally, this provide this is becoming a common trend in web frameworks of offering a command line tool that helps you set up the projects and do builds and run a server with hot reloads and things like that. So in this case, after I install that, I get a new command line called Vue, and if I run Vue, I get a few basic options of it. More or less just starts with a template project. And if I look at the templates, I get a couple of different approaches. Now, I also did a little reading and found out that there's some things that Browserify just doesn't ever intend to support. So I'm going to stick with going through the Webpack support. And I don't really want to go through the simple case because I'm more interested in building a full deployable site eventually. I really want to build this into something that is the front end to a service that stores iterations of maps and run data from actual logs. High aspirations, but maybe we'll get there. So I'm going to go ahead and start with a new project. Okay, so I'm going to call it Tuner. Oh, yes, I can move it. There we go. I could probably even make the font a little bigger if we need to. Okay, so here I'm creating it. I'm just going to call it Tuner. Now, this is where you're getting into these choices about all the different configuration. There's a lot of fancy features that the Vue framework actually has put behind this to make development easier. And you can go really, really lightweight. That's kind of what they're talking about here with the, just go ahead and grab some scripts and throw it into a page and follow. You can write this all in one page. But if you include their runtime and compiler and all these things, you can actually structure things in a much more kind way. The main thing here is it really uses up a lot more space in terms of your checkout, but it's not going to change anything in terms of your development deployment. or the deployment specifically. So now we get a few options. So Vue is, unlike React or Angular or Polymer, in those frameworks, they tend to throw a lot of components at you all at once and try to solve some basic core problems. Polymer, I guess, actually does extract things out into components, but Vue really takes a focus of the core piece is about how do you specify reusable components in a web page, and providing all the structure around that for keeping your project organized and reusing and nesting components. But there's some optional pieces that they add for things like path routing and state storage that'll make it a lot simpler as we move through and make it more complex. So I'm going to go ahead and tell it to go ahead and install Vue Router because I do plan on using it. I'm also going to use ESLint because pretty much I will always use a linter if available. And I'm going to set up unit tests. I don't actually know, but I'm not going to bother with end-to-end right now. And I'm going to continue running npm. Now, so far I've set this all up with terminal, and I'm comfortable there. But when we actually get into editing, I'm much more likely to pick up VS Code these days. I used to be a diehard VI Vim person. I still am in a lot of ways, but I just find that when I'm working on these bigger projects, VS Code's offering a lot of nice features. So while this is going and constructing it, I'm not going to bother trying to open this, but you'll notice that it's pulling down a ridiculous number of modules. This is new to me. In the C++ worlds, there's not a lot of deep dependencies because you have to manage it all yourself. As I've moved into doing like Rust development and things with Cargo, yeah, I'm seeing more finer grained dependencies, but NPM and the Node community definitely have taken this to an extreme. Thankfully, I don't have to deal with it that much. So we'll just wait for that to go. Well, I guess while we're waiting for that, if I go search for Vue in the extensions on VS Code, there's a lot of different options. But on Vue's ecosystem, when I've looked, you'll see there's sections for tooling and the core libraries. And so what I'm really interested in are some of the dev tools. So the dev tools come as a collection of either add-ons for your browser or a standalone app. And so I've already gone ahead and installed that for Chrome. So when we actually pull up a Vue application in the browser, this will give me a bunch of extra information. It understands how to inspect some of the objects and constructs underneath. We already have the web stuff there. but I know that I found yeah. Let's go. Right. There is an official tool, VTour, or VS Code. Now, if you haven't played with VS Code, it's a pretty straightforward editor for the most part, but it does have a lot of plugins, and so you get things like syntax highlighting for sure, snippets, auto-completion, formatting, but you also get things like debugging, which is really cool. You can actually use the built-in debugger even with a JavaScript app or like Rust or other things. So go ahead and install that and get it going. Now over here we can see it tells me it created a new directory, and so I can go into Tuner. And here's what we got. There's this pile of different things. And what I'm going to do is wait for this extension to get installed. And we'll open this up and kind of explore the layout of what we've got. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and open the folder with VS Code. You can set up workspaces and other things, but it's really not necessary for this. So here we have that same layout, but it's a little simpler to understand. And if we go look at the README, it tells me I can install the dependencies and run a development server and also create a build that's all set up for me already. Now, how does that actually work? Well, it uses a package.json just like every other NPM type system or anything else that's using NPM and or node. And it's got all the developer dependencies and the actual dependencies and a couple of scripts that it's actually going to run for those commands. So when we say run dev, it actually is running the Webpack dev server with a configuration. So things in this config directory are mostly about setting up environment configs. If I go look, for example, in the dev, it says, basically set this environment variable to development, and otherwise inherit the production environment, which currently doesn't do much of anything. The build directory is where the actual configuration for the overall build is. So here we have, this is what Webpack is going to parse and use to actually build the site. You can think of it as like compiling your site, it more or less is. And we're not going to have to touch any of this, really, for now. Node modules is where all the locally installed packages go. So that's all these crazy things that got installed. Static is where we can dump any files that we just don't want. Like, we want them to be copied as an asset that we're going to reference them in the website, but we don't actually want Node to do any, or Webpack to do any processing of them. Now, when we look in the source, we start to see the actual core structure of this. And if I go look at the index.html, so the basic site sets up a normal HTML page, and it's just going to have tuner as the title, And the only thing it creates is this single div with an ID of app. Now, obviously that's not going to display anything normally, but part of the build says to also go ahead and include main.js. Now if I go look at what's in here, this actually goes and pulls in Vue and my app component from the /app, as well as a router component, and says it's going to create a new Vue application attached to the app element. So it's going to go find that div, and that's going to be where the app is actually hosted. And we're going to pass in the router and use this instance of the app to actually fill in what goes there. So in this app, it's actually going to just load an app. That's why the template here says basically construct an app tag. So what Vue's doing is each component that you define in Vue becomes a new HTML tag. And it replaces that, like the JavaScript actually goes and replaces those tags with dynamic content. So this tag will get matched to this component, and that's what will get rendered there. And by passing the router in at the application, each component along the way can look at path information, because we're building what's called a single page app, which is, there's really only one HTML page. We already looked at it. Right? This is the single HTML page that we serve. Everything else is dynamically generated. If you think of like Gmail, you have different tabs and things you can go to, but it's still served from one site or one page. And so that's another example of a single page app. So here, this is going to go load that app class, and I don't need to do anything here. This is perfectly fine. And if I go look at my app, it's really going to dump in this asset of a logo, and then it's going to instance a router view. Here it's defining that this component name is app, and there's some style information about, this is just a CSS block to attach to that particular element, which is just going to define that these are the fonts that we prefer over the entire app. This is a color that we prefer over the app, etc. Now, notice that this is app.view. That's a special thing about Vue, where components can be placed into a single file. So this, by putting it in a .view, it lets me put the HTML as a template, any supporting JavaScript, and the CSS that goes with to style that component all in one file as one component. And so that way each component just becomes an individual .view file. So for example, in this case, this says to just create a router view. Well, what is a router view? Okay, well let's take a little detour and go over here. Remember we talked about how there's Vue router. So if I go look at its guide, it'll tell you that it's all about doing this route matching. And what is route matching? So just like we talked about, it's a single page app. And so the path that you use inside of that will actually take you to different pages. So the Vue router parses the path information and provides that information to individual components. And one of the components that they provide is this router view, which lets me say where I want the matched route to actually render. So in our example app, this app is going to render the image and then the router view. And if I go look at the router code, here's the implementation of a router. It says that there's a single path that we're going to match, which is /, which is everything. And it's a named route, so we can reference it by name in other places. And the component that it's going to render there is the hello world component, which comes from this component's hello world. So it's over here. And so here it's going to create this template with a set of links and some messaging and other, other stuff. And here, for example, the message, etc. So let's just go ahead and launch this and see what we see. So if I run vue run dev, npm run dev. So like I said, it's going to go run the Webpack server. Now, the Webpack dev server does what's called hot reload. So behind the scenes, it goes and compiles all the code just like you would do for a deployment and keeps a cache of that it then serves via an HTTP server. It also watches the source files. So when I make a change in my editor and save it, it'll automatically recompile that and reload the page, or in this case, not necessarily actually reload, but reevaluate the page with that new code. So I actually get a almost live preview of what I'm actually developing. So if I go pull this page up, this is the default app. So it started and it matched into the slash path, and here it rendered that logo, which is part of that main page. And then this is all of that hello world template. So if I go click on my extension for Vue, if I open the developer tools console, so we can see that div at the top with the app actually got expanded to include the data from our main app, and that the router view actually got replaced with this hello div, which is the implementation of the router view, which then includes all the content from the actual hello world component. So we can chain all these components and build all the structure out of it. And if I go over here and look at Vue, in the Vue tab, it actually says there's the root, which created an app component, which is the hello world, which is where the router view actually is right now. And inside of that, there's the message that was specified in the JavaScript for the hello world, which is part of its data. And this is all of the route information. So it matched the slash route. And if there were any query parameters or fragments or things like that, these objects would be available. And so I can use these inside of scripts inside that component. Now, Vue builds reactive components, which mean that it's actually going to notice when things change in terms of the data stored in, say, the scripts. So if we look in the code for Hello World, up here at the top, the very first thing is this heading that uses this sequence of 2 curly braces and then an MSG and then 2 curly braces. And that is actually a script tag, or sorry, not a script tag. That is a, I forget what kind of tag they call it. But it essentially says, go look up this variable in the data of this component and put it there, put the contents of that there instead. But it's not a one-time expansion. It happens anytime this data value gets changed. So if I just click this edit and I say, hello everyone, it immediately changed the heading here because Vue underneath the hood has actually created a dynamic link between this component and the data here. So it notices that when this gets changed, and it automatically updates the result here. So that's kind of the basics of Vue. I don't want to get into a huge amount because I actually want to go work on my project. And for that, I'm going to need a new component. I don't want to break the hello world right now. So I think what I'm going to do is in my app, I'm just going to go ahead and create a list of links. So I'm going to create this new component called fuel table. And that may be a terrible name, and we may come back to it later. But I'm mostly interested in getting the components set up. Now I went ahead and changed that. And like I said, it does hot reload. So if I save this and I come back to this page, it's already updated it. Because it saw the change, it compiled it, and then it automatically reloaded the contents in here. Now, for example, it put it next to the logo instead, so I don't know. How do I want to do this? And just to make it There we go. So now I've added these two links, and so for example, this one comes back to the actual hello world. Oh, interesting. I thought I could reference them by name. Name routes. Oh, right, I have to do this now. This is why I do a lot of reading, and then I find out that I don't actually understand it when I really try to sit down and do it. There we go. So if I look now at the bottom of the screen, you can see that this link actually just goes back to the same place because the path for the hello world is a slash. Now if I go over here to fuel table editor, it still goes to slash, but the reason is that I actually haven't defined that route anywhere. And if I come in and look at the console, I bet it will tell me there is no route with that. So it just created a default, but they actually tell me what the error was. So if I come in and I say, well, in that case, I need to go into my router, and I need to create a new route, and I'm going to say, we're going to call it /fuel, and I want to call it fuel table. Okay. Well, now it's reloading. Oh no, it's completely failed because I haven't actually created a fuel component or fuel table. So let's import fuel table from okay, and again, it's going to fail because I haven't done anything yet. And now I'm going to say fuel table view. And now it can compile everything. Okay, so we're up and running. Now this link goes to /fuel. So if I actually click on that link, what happens? Nothing. It did actually go to that. It changed the router view component. It didn't actually reload the page, but it switched the location to the fuel table component, and that just happens to be blank right now. And so that section of the page, that the content of that div got replaced with nothing, because there's just nothing there. So let's go ahead and steal the basic structure of a component. So I'm going to want a template. I'm going to want a script section. And I want a style section. And I specifically want a scoped style, which means that these styles only apply within this component. Now the other important piece of a component is this little export section, which defines some of the initial settings. So for example, it's going to specify what the name of my actual component is, and any initial data that I have, which right now I don't have any, so we're just going to drop that. It requires at least one thing. And now you know why I like linters. So it's already put in my new header for the field table. I don't even have to, like, I actually switched over here and went, oh, is that supposed to, oh, it's already there. Okay, now I want a 3D chart. And if I go searching for view 3D chart, what do I get? I get fusion charts, which I don't believe actually does what I want. A lot of different things. But I looked at this up earlier, and I'm pretty sure that if I search for Plotly, I find that they have created a view component for the Plotly chart library. So what do I need to do? Well, first thing, I need to install it as a component so I can use it. So I'm going to use npm to add it to my project. And while it's doing that, so I'm just going to go ahead and grab this example of, I'm going to go ahead and import this. I know that that's what I'm going to want to do. And I'm going to want to add this component section to say that I'm actually going to use a Plotly component. And now I do need some data. In this case, I'm just going to grab their example data. And then they're going to create a new tag by importing this and having that component. So I get a view Plotly, and I get, I'm going to create a binding from its data to this data object. And, well, actually, this says it's going, every time you create one of my fuel table components, anytime you create a fuel table component, it uses the view Plotly component. And then every time we create one, we should run this function to generate a new block of data. And in this case, that data includes this little plot and this layout and this set of options. And then this tag that I'm going to put up here in the template section says go ahead and instance one of those components. And yes, I have to have exactly one component in or one tag in a component. So now I'm going to have fuel table, and then I'm going to put the Plotly, and it's going to bind this data entry to this data, and this layout tag gets bound to layouts. So anything that I change here in these JavaScript pieces will actually get changed in the rendering, and vice versa. Like, it, well, not always vice versa, but these bindings, I'm going to set it up, are going to mirror what is here in the data. So still managing to wait for all these dependencies to get installed. There we go. So now that that's all there and that's good, then I can do npm run dev. If anybody has questions or wants to ask random things not related to this particular project, feel free. The YouTube comments are available. I'm on Twitter. Okay, so my app is running. Let's reload because the hot reload would have broken probably. Cool. So now I've got a 2D chart, which is a nice step, but I want a 3D chart. So what do I need to do to actually make Plotly create a 3D plot? Now we're kind of at the point where I don't know how to do some of these things. So if you know, feel free to chime in. 3D surface plot. Topo surface plot. So if I just change the type to surface and set Z to be a set of triples. So yeah, it's just creating 24 entries of what appear to be triples. What? Pretty sure Chrome supports WebGL. Yup. it not think it is? Console, something that's going on? Oh, got it. That's link errors. Error in mounted hook. Can't read property canvas of undefined. Hmm. Okay. Sounds like that may actually be an issue of types here. Oh, no, it's supposed to be 3 separate arrays. VueJS is definitely enabled. Well, that's unfortunate. Hmm. No, that's not what I picked at all. With their own work. So it works there, it's just not working in my setup here. So I have Plotly 136.1. And the current release is what? Let's see what happens if we run these file files. Oh, right, I'm not actually running it. So, anybody has recommendations on good 3D plotting libraries for review, I'm happy to hear them. clearly I need to invest in a updated machine. Probably because it's in the midst of. No, it's just the same version. If I remember right, high tables or high charts doesn't actually offer what I want. So what I really want is that surface plot and then a table underneath it. But I really have to really need a surface plot. Is the main thing. Doesn't open through free access. Okay, app is running. Firefox, do what I want. Okay, so it's definitely not a case of the browser. It's definitely something in the library. Well, can I use Matrix? Area bar. Scatter. I have a 3D scatter, but I don't have a 3D surface plot. Yes, that doesn't help me. Well, this is turning into a debug your somebody else's code problem. whole bunch of undefined. So what happened before that? Check the necessity for this line. Really. It's just not even calling it with all the arguments. Okay. Well, no wonder it's... Really? Yeah, it's supposed to be passed to canvas. I don't have any clue how that's supposed to work. I think this is pretty simple over here. tools. Well, my partner's home, so I think this is where we end tonight.